Welcome, members. I see that we do have a quorum, so I will get started. Due to a vacancy in the position of chair, the committee must proceed directly to the election. I
must inform members that the clerk of the committee can only receive motions for the election of the chair.
Not receive any other types of motion, cannot entertain points of order, and cannot participate in debate. So we can now proceed to the election of the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 106.2, the chair must be a member of the government party. Ms. Bendayan.
Thank you, Madam Clerk, and it is a great pleasure and an honor to be able to nominate my colleague, Ali Assassi.
Okay. So it has been moved by Rachel Bendayan that Ali Assassi be elected as chair of the committee. Are there any further motions? Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt the motion? I declare the motion carried and Mr. Assassi duly elected as chair of the committee.
Allow me to start off by thanking you all for the confidence you have placed in me. I can assure you that I will endeavor to the best of my abilities to ensure that this committee continues to work in a collaborative and cooperative manner, but very, very grateful and very humbled. I can also assure you that I will rely heavily on the wisdom of the clerk. Now, re-bienvenue à
Welcome back to meeting number 21 of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development.
Aujourd'hui,
Today, we will be continuing the discussion which had begun on Monday.
Interpretation is available through the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. And for members participating in person, please do bear in mind that the Board of Internal Economy's guidelines for mask use and health protocols. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind all participants to this meeting that screenshots or taking photos of your screen are not permitted. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. A reminder that all comments by members should be addressed through the chair. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my understanding of where we're at process-wise is having completed the election of the chair, we're now back into the committee business rubric. And with that in mind, I'd like to suggest to the committee, perhaps move, that we schedule, we establish a calendar for the remaining meetings of June that allow us to make progress on and complete our existing studies in the areas of vaccine equity, Ukraine, and Taiwan. So I'd like to move that, and we can proceed to discussion on it.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure that you can move another motion while there is a motion on the floor. And I would further seek direction from the clerk as to what motion is currently on the floor, because in reviewing the Blues last week, I noticed that there may in fact be two motions on the floor at the moment. So perhaps we could get some direction from the clerk as to what is possible at this time. Certainly very interested to getting to the scheduling of witnesses and to proceeding with the important work of our committee.
Thank you. Yes, I will consult with them.
Maybe on the same point of order, we just completed something which was the election of a chair. I don't understand how the election of the chair could occur without us not being on another item of business. So if members want to propose the resumption of some other matter, but our view is that we should get on with the studies that we have on the table. Insofar as we've just completed the election of the chair, there aren't any motions before the committee right now, so I've just moved a proposal in terms of how we move forward.
Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
On that, I think we're on one point of order. I would like the chair to actually advise the committee as to what motion. This was not an adjourned meeting. It was a suspended meeting. I think that the opposition is clearly aware of what the difference is between a suspended meeting. Maybe they're not, and maybe you'll need to explain that to them, but experienced parliamentarians should know what a suspended meeting is. So when a meeting is suspended, we will have work on the floor. The resignation of a chair and the election of a new chair is simply not related to the suspension of the meeting. The meeting continues, and so we have a motion. I believe it might have been amended, and it might have been sub-amended, and we would like to have clarity about that, and then perhaps discussion on where we are at with those. Thank you.
Just respond quickly to Mr. Oliphant. I'm fully aware.
Sir, on a point of order, if you allow him to respond,
But is he allowing you now, or?
Yes, I did allow Mr.
Okay.
Oliphant. Mr. Genis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize on behalf of all of us for making your job challenging on your first day here with these procedural questions. But I understand the difference between an adjourned meeting and a suspended meeting, but I also understand the long-established precedent of a committee that if we're debating an item of business and then we are debating another item of business, we cannot also be debating the original item of business. So insofar as we are obliged by the rules of the House of Commons to have moved immediately to the selection of a chair, and having done that, then it is illogical. There may be precedents that can be cited, but it seems illogical to me to say that there is something else still on the floor when we have just completed the election of the chair, which is clearly a distinct item.
Thank you. I must say, as you have rightly pointed out, that I face a unique dilemma, but I think it's only fair that I consult with the clerk and I defer to her better judgment as to the point of order that Ms. Ben-Dayan has raised.
Mr. Chair, may I make just a point on this point of order?
Mr. Moratz.
Mr. Chair, I also had my hand raised.
Ah bon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to point out that under Bosch and Gagnon, Chapter 20, essentially that when the chair resigned, the committee became unconstituted. Under Chapter 20, it says very specifically, before a committee can begin to consider its work at the beginning of a parliamentary session, it must be properly constituted. That is, its members must be appointed and a chair designated. I think the argument here is that because the chair resigned, the committee became unconstituted. It has now been reconstituted with the election of a chair, and new motions can be entertained.
Thank you, Mr. Moratz. Mr. Bergeron.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two things. First, regarding the comment from Mr. Oliphant, who suggested that the opposition didn't know the difference between a suspension and an adjournment, I would ask him to specify that he was referring to the official opposition, because I was the one who was chairing when the debate was suspended, and I'm in the opposition, so I know the difference between suspension and adjournment. And then, to what Mr. Morant said, I have to say that the committee cannot be considered unconstituted because there wasn't an election of vice chairs. He and I both remain vice chairs of this committee. So I think it was simply a priority motion to proceed to electing the chair so work could continue. But we are continuing the meeting that was suspended last time.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Now I will suspend to consult with the clerk. Thank you. with the benefit of speaking to the clerk, we will now resume. There are a number of different issues that I had an opportunity to speak to the clerk about. The first one is the issue that was raised by Mr. Bergeron. The reality is, as was pointed out, that the meeting was previously suspended. So the manner in which we have been proceeding is actually correct. Insofar as Mr. Morantz's issue is concerned, did have a opportunity to look at the third edition of the House of Commons Procedure and Practice, and did find the passage that you referenced, Mr. Morantz. It does read as follows. In the event of a vacancy in the office of chair, the committee cannot conduct any other business until a new chair is chosen. This is similar to procedure in the House, where a vacancy in the office of Speaker must be filled before any other matter can be considered. So I think a reading of this particular passage does confirm that we did proceed in the appropriate fashion. That would have been the first order of business to come up with a chair. Now, moving to the point of order raised by Ms. Bendayan. I think it's fair to say that it has been the practice of this committee under the previous chair to make sure that we are masters of our own proceedings. And so the practice that was previously developed and followed was that we could deal with various issues that did arise concurrently, if that was the will of the members. Now, we have a point of order from a procedural standpoint that the practice is that if there are two substantive motions, that should not be allowed. In fact, if the members do look at page 1068 of the House of Commons Procedure and Practice, it says that if a dilatory motion is accompanied by a condition, it becomes a substantive motion. So Ms. Bendayan's read and interpretation of the rules is quite correct. We have two substantive motions before us. Now, I should say and emphasize that, as always, the chair is guided by the will of the committee. And up until now, members have seen fit to embark on the original practice, and the previous chair allowed members to intervene and make their positions known, with what I imagine to be the ultimate goal of concluding debate in a way that can be meaningful for all. Now that a point of order has been raised, I find myself in the position of having to rule in line with the procedures outlined previously, as I pointed out, that you cannot have concurrently have two substantive motions. Currently, the committee has these two substantive motions on the floor simultaneously. I will rule accordingly in reference to the procedures that the second motion is to be deemed out of order.
Point of order,
Guide
Mr.
the
Chair.
committee back to the original motion and amendment that is currently before it. As always, I should say and emphasize that that should any member of this committee not agree with this particular ruling, they may challenge this decision.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I want to make a number of points with respect to the point you made. First of all, a point of order was raised with respect to the question of whether or not we are currently debating motions. You had ruled that there cannot be multiple substantive motions, and I'll get to the issue of the adjournment piece of that in a moment. But you had ruled that there can't be multiple substantive motions on the table. We were dealing previously, my point was, we had been dealing previously with the substantive matter of the election
Mr.
of the
Chair,
chair,
Mr.
which is
Chair,
clearly a
point of order.
substantive matter.
It's a point of order in that I believe you're now engaging in debate. If one of the members wants to challenge your
I'm making
ruling,
an
which has
argument with
been
respect
made,
to order.
we do not debate in committee, Mr. Chair. I would just caution us as a committee. We do not debate the ruling of a chair unless it's been challenged. And so you have made a ruling, and you have said that there was an original motion on the floor, a second substantive motion. You have ruled it out of order. If one of the members would like to challenge you, that is their privilege. However, that needs to be voted on immediately. And so I believe that if the honourable member across would like to challenge you, it is his right, but it is not his right or our need in this committee to entertain that debate. Thank you.
If I could just finish my point of order. I was in the middle of a point of order when another
Mr.
point of
Janice, I
order
didn't
interrupted.
recognize you, and Mr. Oliphant has spoken about that as to what the proper procedure is. You cannot challenge.
Of order about that. I was in the middle of a point of order. Mr. Oliphant interrupted me, and you gave him the floor in the middle of my point of order. And I think it's important for you as chair to think about engaging with all parties in a constructive way.
Point of order.
And
I'd like to know who has the floor right now, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Can you tell us who has the floor
again,
right
I
now?
have another member of the government interrupting me on a point of order.
Hold on a second. Point of order.
But you can't
I'd like to know
interrupt
who
the
has
point of order
floor
with a
right
point
now.
of order and claim the floor. Like, I waited till Mr. Oliphant was finished, even though he had been interrupting my point
I'd
of
like to
order.
know who has the floor right
Mr. Janice, that is not the point. The point is before you're allowed to proceed, you have to be recognized by the chair.
That's Mr. Chair. And then Mr. Oliphant interrupted me.
But as
And now Mr. Suberi is interrupting me. Can I have the floor to make the point I was making originally? That's what
Yes,
I'm asking.
But this is not a debate. You appreciate that. But if you do
I
have
am
a
making
point of
arguments with
order-
respect to procedure under the rubric of a point of order. Point of order. It is legitimate for a point of order to include arguments in the context of
Mr.
matters
Chair,
of order.
could I ask if you
Here
have
we go
indeed
again.
made a ruling which is then debatable?
Here we go again.
Or is it not debatable? I think that is very important. I think that the members need to know the procedure right now. If it is a debatable, the decision you have made, we had an opportunity to have points of order.
I haven't been
and
able to
debate
get a
before
sentence
you
out.
made your ruling. You've made your ruling. That is the way Parliament works.
That is correct, Mr. Oliphant.
Sorry.
May I finish my point of order, Mr. Chair?
It's not debatable, Mr. Janice.
Mr. Chair, with respect, Mr. Oliphant had an opportunity to run for chair, and he chose not to. I would like to be able to make my point of order, make the argument with respect to the matter of procedure, and then I invite you to make a ruling on those arguments. Because what seems to be happening here is that following the ruling of a previous chair, a new chair is making a different ruling to negate the ruling of the previous chair, to throw out a motion that was on the floor, and to do so without allowing arguments from members of Parliament with respect to the appropriateness of that matter. That is incredible. So I'm asking at a minimum for the opportunity to make arguments with respect to the matter of order for your consideration, Mr. Chair. Surely you'd like to hear the views of members with respect to matters of order before we proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Janice, but I believe that you are engaging in debate. Is it your intention to challenge the ruling?
Mr. Chair, it is my intention to assert the privileges of members of Parliament in this committee. That is, it is my intention to make arguments to you, the Chair, with respect to a matter of order. That is to make the point that at multiple committees in this House, at the Citizenship and Immigration Committee, at the Status of Women Committee, and previously on multiple occasions at this committee, those are the cases that I know of in the last few months. Members have proposed motions for adjournment. Mr. Chair, who's the staff member you're consulting with? I hope you're listening to the arguments that are being made. Mr. Chair, there have been multiple instances in this Parliament in multiple committees where members have moved motions to adjourn with committee, motion to adjourn with conditions, and those motions have been deemed debatable. Ms. Zaid, the chair of the Immigration Committee, and Ms. Vecchio, the chair of the Status of Women Committee, and your predecessor, Mr. Svengeman, all ruled those motions to be in order. And so now we have a new chair after the resignation of Mr. Svengeman, who all of a sudden wants to overrule the precedent on this matter. Now, the Parliament should be guided by precedent. Precedent is the basis on which we understand the interpretations of these rulings. And that precedent has consistently been at multiple committees in various committees of this House that when there is a substantive motion on the table, it is considered legitimate to move an amendment motion with a condition. And that while it is not acceptable to move a different substantive motion on a different matter, when it is an adjournment motion with a condition, that it is legitimate to do so. Now, insofar as that is a gray area in the rules, because the rules don't specify with respect to an amendment motion with a condition, we should be guided by the precedent of multiple committees, including by this committee. And what you're saying is to try to overrule the precedent and the ruling of the previous chair without even giving opportunities for other members to hear arguments. That is outrageous, Mr. Chair, and it's not going to function very well as a committee if you show such flagrant disregard for the rights of members.
Mr. Jenis, one more time, I will repeat the question that I have posed to you previously. Is it your intention to challenge my ruling?
Mr. Chair, I will like you to consider the arguments that have been made about precedent at previous committees.
Mr. Chair, making a point of order on that, I would read from the Rules of Procedure. Disorder and misconduct in a committee may arise as a result of the failure to abide by the rules and practices of a committee or to respect the authority of the chair. Stepping down, in the event of disorder, the chair may suspend the meeting until order can be restored. I just would remind the committee that you have that authority, that if your ruling is being disrespected by one of the members of the committee, it is disorder.
Thank you.
There are precedents for that.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Oliphant. I presume that you are referring to Chapter 21, which relates to disorderly conduct. However, just to clarify further, I would like to draw everyone's attention to page 1059 of the Rules of Procedure. And the third paragraph does read as follows. Decisions by the chair are not debatable. Now, I understand that Mr. Chong, you do have a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My point of order is I'm actually unclear on exactly what your ruling was. So I'd like you to clarify. I think you ruled a motion or out of order, right? And are we referring, you made reference to two motions, and I believe you ruled the second motion out of order, and I am not certain what that second motion was. Are we referring to the motion that I believe Mr. Genuis introduced regarding adjourning debate and going back to, or the motion Mr. Genuis had introduced that referred to Ukraine, that we were debating previously before the meeting, the previous meeting had been suspended? Is that the motion that you had ruled out of order?
That is correct.
Okay.
The ruling was that you cannot concurrently have two substantive motions before a committee. And the basis for that decision, if you'd like to know, is page 1068, the House of Commons Procedure and Practice, which states that if a dilatory motion is accompanied by a condition, it becomes a substantive motion, therefore debatable and amendable. It's also true according to
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I
procedures.
just wanted to clarify that. Thank you. I understand.
Mr. Chair, I have another point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chair, the original question raised by the point of order, as I understood it, was pertaining to the election of the chair as if that was a substantive matter before the committee. So could you clarify in your ruling whether the election of the chair was considered a substantive matter before the committee?
Mr. Genis, I can assure you that that was not what was decided. that is an issue which is separate and apart. At no point was it suggested that the election of a chair would constitute a second substantive motion.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I'm seeking further clarification. Your ruling seems to me to be that the election of the chair is not a substantive matter, but a motion to adjourn is a substantive matter if it is attached to a condition. Could you maybe just explain a little bit more to the committee to help our understanding about why you would deem that the election of the chair is not a substantive matter, but that the adjournment motion is a substantive matter? I think it might be helpful for those who are trying to reconcile the conflicting precedents in the future.
I do believe this is disorder and disrespect of the chair's ruling. You have made a ruling, and you do not.
You were not recognized, Mr.
rules.
Oliphant. That's disorder. You started speaking before you were recognized.
Could I speak?
Mr. Oliphant?
Point of order, Mr. Chair, if I can be recognized. May I be recognized?
You decide.
May I be recognized, Mr. Chair?
Allow Mr. Oliphant to proceed, and then if you have a point of order, Mr. Zuberi, we will
This is the third attempt, Mr. Janis, to disrupt the meeting and disrespect your ruling as a chair. He has parliamentary privilege to challenge the ruling. That challenge may be made. There is a process for it to be made. It will be voted on immediately, and then we can proceed to the business. My understanding is there was a motion on the floor to do a future study. There was an amendment which was not challenged. It wasn't. It was Mr. Svengman as chair did not rule on it. He just allowed it. So there wasn't a case of a procedure that you are changing. It was the first time a point of order has been allowed or been raised on whether that was a substantive or a dilatory motion. The motion has been, the point of order has been raised. You have ruled on it. I would ask us now to either proceed to the original motion, which was raised, or have the chair challenged.
Just on the same point of order, I see that.
I'm sorry,
Mr. Janis, you have not been recognized. Mr.
I'd like to be recognized next,
Zuberi, please proceed.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. Chair. I'd ask all colleagues to allow the chair to recognize them before they enter into any form of debate or intervention in the committee, if that's possible, so we can move ahead with our business, as we all want to do. As our colleague, Mr. Genuis, also expressed initially in his initial remarks, where he wants to move into studies and whatnot for us to be productive and do the work we need to do. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing me.
Thank you, Mr. Zuberi. Is it a point of order?
Yes. I think it's just interesting, Mr. Oliphant providing rationale for the chair's decision, and I think the chair is perfectly capable of providing that rationale himself. But just to respond to Mr. Oliphant, who did make substantive arguments with respect to this, the chair was presented with a motion which the chair allowed, the previous chair allowed. The same thing happened at the Status of Women Committee. The same thing happened at the Immigration Committee. Those are three different committees that I know of where three different chairs, in 2 out of 3 cases, those were members elected within the government party, made those decisions.
I believe in you're engaging in debate once again.
I'm just responding respectfully, Mr. Chair. I'm just responding to Mr. Oliphant, and continuously he is allowed to finish his remarks, and then I'm being told I'm engaging in debate when I'm offering more limited responses to Mr. Oliphant's argument. So it's a new day with a new chair, and there are some things that are happening here, and I want to just make sure that I'm afforded the same opportunities as Mr. Oliphant to be able to make arguments with respect to procedure. And I think all members from all parties should be treated fairly and given those same opportunities, regardless of whatever different staffers are hoping to see.
Thank you, Mr. Janis. I have to say that I do very much agree with you that all members should be treated fairly. However, as was noted, the previous chair had actually not rendered a ruling on this issue. So no ruling had actually been made by the previous chair. In this particular instance, having had an opportunity to refer to the rules, I have made a ruling. Is it your intention to challenge ruling.
Mr. Chair, before I make a decision on that, I'd like to just get some advice from the clerk, if that's acceptable. Is it acceptable for a member to ask the clerk for advice on a matter?
For me to ask?
No, for a member to ask the clerk for advice on the record.
For suspension, then.
Well,
Do you want to ask for a suspension?
would you grant a suspension to consult on this?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to listen to the question and to the clerk's response, so perhaps we can get on with it.
Did you?
I'm not agnostic in general, but I'm agnostic on this matter. Whether you want to suspend or I can pose my question.
Did you want to pose the question to the chair? And I will undertake to consult with the clerk.
Sorry, is the clerk going to be able to respond to the committee, or are you going to consult with her and then tell us what your interpretation of the response?
We will ensure that the clerk can actually speak to every member of the committee.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I would just wonder if the clerk can highlight any precedents that she's aware of with respect to the issue of suspension with a condition, but in particular, if the clerk could share information about how committees are typically guided by historic practice, as well as by interpretation of written rules.
Madam Clerk, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can speak to this a little bit. So in this committee in particular, the adjournment motion with a condition has been used in the past. One of the recent examples I can think of is during the meeting of May 5th, when there was a motion on the floor and our Tibetan delegation was here. And so you moved to adjourn debate on the motion until the questioning of the witnesses was completed. That would be another such example of what we had before us. Now, it is up to the committee to decide which way they would like to run their own proceedings. They do that within the framework that is provided to them by the standing orders of the House and the House of Commons procedure and practice. If a committee finds a practice that it likes and it is able to continue with that practice within that same framework, then it's completely up to the committee to decide whether or not they will continue with that practice. If there is a question as to whether or not that practice is contrary to the rules of procedure set out by the House of Commons, which is a higher procedural authority, it is then raised in a point of order, and it is up to the chair to determine whether or not that practice should continue. And I can address a little bit about precedents from one committee to the other, if you like. Precedents within the House of Commons chamber are very important because there is only one chamber. While there are multiple committees, precedents from one committee to the next generally do not transfer because committees are masters of their own proceedings. So you cannot say on the one hand that you're the master of your own proceeding, but you're also tied down to the precedents that happened in not your own committee, if that makes sense.
Madam Clerk, just to make sure I understand.
Order, Mr. Chair. Now that we have had the benefit of that clarification, I fear that what is happening here is that we are wasting the time of the committee intentionally so, and it is regrettable that the official opposition is doing this. There is work to be done in this committee, and I would ask you to indicate what motion is currently on the floor so that we may debate that motion rather than engage in these procedural shenanigans in order to push the work of the Foreign Affairs Committee to never. We have 3 more weeks, sir, and I believe that we all have work in front of us, including a study on Ukraine. May I remind all members of this committee that the war in Ukraine continues to rage while we debate in this committee procedural nonsense as a result of Mr. Genuine's desire to avoid substantive work.
On the same point
Thank
of order,
you, Ms.
Mr. Chair.
Ben-Nayan.
May I be
Thank you, Ms.
recognized?
Ben-Nayan. I think we've had ample opportunity today, over the course of the past hour almost, to clarify these rules of procedure, Mr. Jonas. So I will ask you, I believe this is the 6th time I am asking you this. I have made a ruling And is it your intention to challenge it? I would be grateful if you could keep your comments strictly focused as to whether you intend to challenge that ruling or not.
Mr. Chair, this is quite incredible. I mean, Ms. Bendayan just launched an attack on me and my motivations, and you let her finish while you nodded along, and then you tell me what I can and cannot say or do. Let me make this very simple. I'd like to seek the unanimous consent of this committee to adjourn debate on the matters before it and proceed to consideration of our calendar so that we can program the next 3 weeks to get back to our business. If members refuse unanimous consent to adjourn debate on this motion on a completely other subject, then I think it will be hard for them to play this game of pretend that it's somebody else's fault that we're not talking about the issues we should be talking about. So I'm seeking unanimous consent of the committee to adjourn debate on whatever motions are or aren't before us. And I'll start with that.
Unanimous consent will not be given to stifle a debate on a potential motion to discuss women's reproductive rights. Very clearly, on this side of the House, we will not adjourn debate on that
Mr. Chair, was this
issue
member
because
recognized?
It is only to get it on our agenda. It's an important issue, so no.
Are you enforcing rules on this member, Mr. Chair?
Mr. Oliphant, can I ask that you wait till you're recognized, and then please, if you need additional time, please do raise your point of order. So I've made every effort to ensure that we are proceeding in an orderly fashion. I have attempted to canvass the opinion of the member as to whether he wishes to challenge or not. I have not heard any answers after, I believe, 7 occasions I have asked. So
I've just been repeatedly interrupted, but I'm happy to challenge your ruling, Mr. Chair. But I was seeking the opportunity to make arguments with respect and get clarification on your ruling before doing so. I was repeatedly interrupted by other members, and you did not address that matter.
Mr. Jenness, I did not recognize you to speak.
Okay, well,
and
I'm challenging your ruling.
On numerous occasions, I have pointed you to authority.
May I challenge your ruling?
Yes, you may do so,
Okay,
but that doesn't get in the way.
Glad Mr. Oliphant clarified that. Thank you.
You may do so. So that being said, we will now have to resume debate about. What's that? Do we have to proceed to a vote? Okay. So we will. My apologies. So we will take a vote as to whether the ruling stands.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The motion is. The question is, shall the decision of the chair be sustained? Ms. Bendayan.
We.
Mr. Gahir.
Yes.
Mr. Oliphant.
Yes.
Mr. Sarai.
Yes.
Mr. Zuberi.
Yes.
Ms. Gladue. Mr. Chong.
No.
Mr. Genuis.
No.
Mr. Morantz.
No.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Oui.
Ms. McPherson. Yes. Mr. Chair, that is 7 yeas and 4 nays.
Thank you. So that being the decision of the committee, the ruling does stand, and we will now revert back to debate regarding the amendment to the motion.
have that read, the amendment to the motion read.
The amendment to the, yes, please, Madam Clerk.
So currently the amendment is to delete the words that the committee hold no fewer than 5 meetings.
Correct. Yes, Mr. Janis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do I have the floor? Okay.
You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is great. I can speak on the motion without other members speaking at the same time. Maybe we'll see what other practices of the committee are evolving in light of the change in leadership. I do, notwithstanding some points of disagreement, want to congratulate you, Mr. Chair, on the position that you have ascended to, and now we return to debate on the question of the committee's forward agenda, and the circumstances which have led us to debate the committee's foregoing agenda are that in the midst of 3 different studies on clearly pressing global issues, in the midst of a study on the horrific ongoing further invasion of Ukraine, in the midst of a study on vaccine equity, on COVAX, intellectual property issues related to that, and other issues around health systems in the developing world, and in the midst of a study on Taiwan and potential security threats to Taiwan. In the midst of those 3 studies, a member of the government decided to go outside the normal process for setting the agenda of the committee, and that member chose to try to move a substantive motion, effectively resetting the agenda of the committee, to move that substantive motion at committee. And our members of our side did our best to be reasonable and to say, look, instead of trying to insert another item of business in the midst of these 3 ongoing studies, instead, it would make more sense for us to refer this matter to the Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedure. The Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedure, as members know, is specifically set up for the purposes of reviewing the agenda of the committee, and it has a mandate to operate in a collaborative manner. The usual way that this committee sets its agenda is that questions of the way a debate is unfolding, questions of the committee's agenda, are discussed among parties in the context of the Committee on Agenda and Procedure. That the Committee on Agenda and Procedure considers those matters, reviews those matters, and therefore proceeds with a recommendation that is generally adopted by all members. Now, that is a very effective way to proceed. It prevents the need for lengthy debates about agenda on the floor of the committee, and it presents a kind of perverse majoritarianism. You could imagine a situation in which a majority of members of the committee set the entire agenda of the committee and decide all of the studies that happen at that committee. That has generally not been the way this committee has worked. It's made more sense for us to bring ideas to the Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedure, and then to be able to define an agenda that is respectful of the different issues that different parties are raising. And certainly there are many important issues, and this is how we set our initial agenda. It was to say that we would focus on these 3 urgent issues of the situation in Ukraine, threats to Taiwan, and COVAX. And I think the ability to have all parties engaged in that process led to a consensus around an agenda that would be substantive and nonpartisan and avoid the kind of politicized aspects that happen sometimes at other committees, but that generally we wanted to avoid at the Foreign Affairs Committee. We wanted to see this as being an effective multi-party forum for proposing collaborative work on important global issues that are facing that Canada has to respond to. And in the midst of that, we had a motion that was put forward on abortion, and I think it's in a context where we see many motions on abortion being put forward at many different committees. And there were different aspects
Point
of
of
that
order, Mr.
motion.
Chair.
The implied.
There's a point of order by Ms. McPherson.
I'm looking for some clarity. The motion that I believe we are talking about is not a motion on abortion. It is a motion on the reproductive health of women and their rights around the world. So I'm wondering if we could have you clarify what the actual, if you could read the initial motion, because I don't believe that that's what it is solely about. And I know that there's been a lot brought forward in this committee where we've heard testimony from the Conservatives saying that it is something that it is very clearly not. So if you could just clarify what the motion is, because I don't believe that's accurate.
Yes.
On the same point of order, Mr. Chair, I wonder if you can clarify if questions of accuracy are matters of order or matters of debate.
Ms. McPherson, thank you for your question. You are absolutely correct. We should all attempt to the best of our abilities to ensure that the debate is relevant to the issue at hand. Insofar as the amendment is concerned, it relates to one issue and one issue alone. The scope of the issue before our committee currently is whether, and this is in accordance with the amendment, whether several words in the original amendment, the original motion, should be deleted or not. And the words that I am referring to are that the committee hold no fewer than 5 meetings. So that is what we are currently debating, and I would ask all members to ensure that to the extent that they are engaging in this debate, they keep their remarks relevant to that very limited scope. Ms. Bendiah.
I had the floor still, Mr. Chair?
You did. My apologies.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
Mr. James.
Thank you for returning the floor to me, Mr. Chair. I had actually raised another point of order, which was the question of, because which you didn't respond to, and that's your prerogative, and that's fine. I won't make a big issue of it. But the issue was, of course, I was debating aspects of this motion, and Ms. McPherson raised a point of order in the context of that, saying that she thought I was describing the motion in an inaccurate way, and she was allowed to complete allegedly a point of order that was not, in fact, about order at all. It was about her interpretation of the substantive qualities and merits of the motion. I think in the interest of consistency, it's important to say that matters of order are about the rules of the committee. They are not about whether you think somebody is characterizing the motion in an accurate way or not. Having said that, I think respectfully that Ms. McPherson is incorrect in her comments, and again, it's not a matter of order that she's incorrect. It's simply a matter of debate that she's incorrect. The motion uses the word abortion 4 or 5 times. So it would be odd to contend that the motion is not about abortion. And that's fine, but just suffice it to say that this is the Foreign Affairs Committee, and motions respecting the same issue have been brought forward at many, many other committees. And, we know how much our friends in the Prime Minister's office want to kind of bring in debates that are happening in the context of American politics and try to make them, and in fact, in the case of foreign affairs, it seems with this motion, direct this committee to go and study developments in American politics, which is quite interesting. But our view is that there are certain matters before the committee. And this is why this amendment is important, because at the very least, a reasonable step, here we go again, a reasonable step.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, it seems incorrect, but that the member has suggested that the PMO wrote this motion, and I would just like to ask whether or not that would be accurate, and whether or not he would be suggesting that the PMO wrote the motion that I brought forward at the Human Rights Subcommittee on a very similar topic, because of course I'm not part of the government and I have very big interests in the rights of women. So I'm just wondering whether or not he would like to retract that.
If we're doing points of order for inaccuracy, I don't know if I agree with the member's statement that she's not part of the government at this point, but can I proceed with my comments,
Yes,
Chair?
Mr. Jennings.
Thank you. I think would you be prepared to rule that the member's point of order was not, in fact, a point of order?
Yes, my understanding is that was not a point of order.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. That is my favorite ruling that you've made so far in this committee, and I think it will go entirely unchallenged. So thank you for your display of wisdom on that point. I appreciate it very much. Mr. Chair, this brings us to why the amendment that is before the committee is important. The amendment deals specifically with the question of how much time is going to be allocated to this study. And transparently, my goal with this amendment is to say, is to be consistent with the general belief that most, if not all, of the matters of the agenda of the committee should be evaluated by the subcommittee on agenda and procedure. That is the proper and appropriate place for these conversations to take place. And that we should generally be reluctant to pass motions at all on programming the committee's agenda without first allowing the matter to be considered by the committee on agenda and procedure. But at the very least, we should seek to be minimally prescriptive, and being minimally prescriptive creates that opportunity for then the agenda on committee and procedure to at least weigh in to some extent, and for us to be able to be a little bit more nimble and a little bit more responsive to the emerging circumstances that are in front of us. Now, it's my belief that the problem with prescribing the 5 meetings as proposed in this motion is that there are other urgent matters of ongoing study before the committee. And one of those matters is, of course, the war in Ukraine. Notably, this committee began its work at the time, a Russian invasion had started. There was the occupation of Crimea and other areas, but it was in fact prior to the further invasion that began at the end of February that this committee had begun its work on Ukraine.
Point of order on relevance, Mr. Speaker. I believe the amendment is quite clear. You read it into the record, and I would argue that this is not relevant to the amendment. I look to you for a ruling on that.
I'm happy to respond on that point of order, Mr. Chair, as well, if you'd like to hear my perspective before a ruling.
Further to that point of order, I'd like to add as well. I think he's mentioned the member.
Can I speak first, Mr. Chair, or is there an order for speaking to the points of order?
I'll offer you the floor before in terms of this point of order.
Maybe you could be the chair now.
No, one too many.
Thank you, Ms. Benayan. As you know, it is important that the members bear in mind that their remarks should be relevant. As you have pointed out, the scope of the issue before us is very, very limited and narrow. It is as to whether this committee should commit a minimum of 5 days to this study. So I think it is incumbent on all the members to bear that in mind, to keep their comments focused on that issue, and to refrain from debating the main motion. I think at this juncture, it should be limited to the temporal limitation that was contained in the amendment to the motion.
And Mr. Chair, given the amendment scope, I don't believe that there's any indication of when those 5 days could be. It could be next year. It's certainly not indicated in the motion as to when that is. So this diatribe and argumentation
point of order,
regarding these
was
other
she given the
issues,
floor, Mr.
is
Chair?
that relevant to
Mr.
this
Chair, was she
debate,
given the
Mr.
floor?
Chair?
But I wanted to comment on the
Ben-Diane.
point of order as well. So I just wonder.
I have the floor.
Thank you. But I'm seeking clarity from the chair because the chair spoke, and then you started speaking again. So did you continue to have the floor while he spoke?
You can ask the chair.
That's what I just did. Yeah.
I would ask all members to ensure that they are recognized before they proceed with their points of order. Mr. Jenis.
Thank you. Just to clarify, do I have the floor on the point of order, or are we back to be having the floor on the substantive matter?
I believe you have the floor on the substantive
Excellent.
of
Thank
the
you, Mr.
amendment
Chair.
to the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And maybe I think it's just important before I go back to what I was saying to kind of clarify the link, because I think it's important then, since it's been contested. The amendment pertains to the number of meetings that should take place on some prospective study that has been proposed by Dr. Fry, and perhaps in collaboration with others. The question of whether we should set a minimum number of meetings is, of course, a question about the committee's agenda. And it would seem to me difficult to consider the question of how many meetings that should be set aside for a particular item without also, in relation to that, considering the question of what other possible matters could be considered in those same meetings. And that top of mind in terms of the question of what other matters could be considered would, it seems to me, be the existing work of this committee. So respectfully, I make no apologies for making the case for the importance of other matters that could be discussed at the committee. And I think that is central to the question of how many meetings
Mr. Chair, can I have a point of
we
information?
should be.
Yes, Ms. McPherson.
This is a point of information, and forgive me if I've got this wrong. I'm learning some of this mostly in this committee. I'm just wondering whether or not this member will have unlimited time to debate this amendment, or whether we'll be getting to any business today, or will it just be this for the next 45 minutes? It's just a point of information, whether the debate can be limited.
Thank you for that, Ms. McPherson. I think it's important to highlight that the members do have as much time as is required and needed to debate a motion or an amendment to a motion. That having been said, it is important the members actually ensure that the points that they are arguing are relevant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
It wasn't a point of order.
Ms. Ben-Diane.
Sorry, on that point of clarification, could the clerk clarify until what time we have this room? I'm certainly prepared to listen to this until midnight. I just want to be able to schedule things accordingly.
I did consult with the clerk, and at this particular point, it is unverified. We have no response on that specific issue. Mr. Jenis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and we're deleting old practices and creating new ones at the same time. We're having points of information, and which are a previously unknown practice. And I don't want to be too much of a stickler if members want information.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Oh.
Mr. Zuberi.
Thank you for recognizing me. I'm wondering if people's intervention on this amendment to the motion has to remain fixed and focused on the amendment to the motion in question. If that's the case, I'd ask that anybody who's intervening be succinct so that we can grasp the essence of what they're trying to say. Thank you for recognizing me again, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Zuberi. Yes, you are correct. All members are required to keep their remarks focused on the substance of the amendment to the motion.
If I can, if I may,
Zuberi.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Zuberi.
Could I ask that because I myself am I am paying attention, but I'm not grasping what is being in terms of the essence of what's being said. I'm not sure if other members of the committee are feeling similarly. Would you be willing to, I just put it forth, intervene and in order to make sure that these comments are succinct so we can actually move on with our business, but also so that anybody who's intervening can be effective and not waste words? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zuberi. I will do so by emphasizing and underscoring how important it is that all members keep their remarks relevant to the issue at hand. Thank you. Mr. Jenis?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a great deal of respect for Mr. Zuberi. We work together quite a bit, and I think one of the one of the challenge. He's being very friendly, but I don't know that the public can see. But anyways, I think the challenge maybe is that I am so frequently being interrupted with points of order, points of information, points of practice, points of debate, and points of general grumpiness that it is difficult to proceed with any line of reasoning. So sometimes in the House, the Speaker calls upon ministers to begin from the beginning again, and I won't do that fully. But perhaps I can try to directly answer Mr. Zuberi's question, and I don't plan to miss Ben Diane's comments. I certainly don't plan to talk until midnight. I plan to be wrapping up my intervention on this topic well before then. But look, the amendment that we're discussing to try to respond to Mr. Zuberi's request for us to grasp the essence of the topic before us. The amendment that we are discussing is an amendment to remove, and the point isn't really 5 meetings. It is to amend out the prescriptive reference to a minimum number of meetings from the motion. It is based on the belief that the work of this committee should be shaped by the subcommittee on agenda and procedure meeting together with a mandate to work in a collaborative way. And what I would like to see in an ideal world is for this committee not to adopt motions programming the agenda of the committee going forward without first receiving a report and a series of recommendations from the subcommittee on agenda and procedure. That would be my preference. And in fact, early on in this conversation, we moved a motion to refer this matter to the subcommittee on agenda and procedure, which wasn't about tricks or anything. It was a very straightforward way of trying to move the conversation along, saying, okay, well, we've got this idea, we've got I can't speak to motions that are on notice, of course, because they're not public, but we have prospectively we might have motions that on notice. Prospectively, we might have many motions that have been put on notice by other members as well. This one was moved, but there might prospectively be other motions that have been put on notice on various other topics that we could study. Let's refer all of that to the subcommittee on agenda and procedure
A point of order,
to allow those matters. And
Point of
Mr.
order.
Zubari is not going to be happy with you, Mr. Sarai, because you've now interrupted this explanation of the essence of the topic.
I have a point of order, Mr. Assassi.
But
Mr. Sarai.
I'm sure that
Chair, I've been trying to listen. The motion amendment is a very simple one. It's to have 5 meetings. I've heard nothing about why we should have 5 meetings. I've heard how many times the word abortion is in the original motion. I've heard why it wasn't referred or was referred or an amendment was made to refer it to a subcommittee. I have yet to hear one word on why it should be 5 meetings. Therefore, there is absolutely zero relevance to one word this member has said in the last hour and a half that he's been speaking on this amendment. I ask you, I applaud you to please rule on this. Otherwise, this will continue. This makes no sense. If he wants to speak on the actual motion itself after this amendment is passed or defeated, he has all liberty to do so. But every single word that has been said from this member on his own amendment has had absolutely nothing to do with the amendment itself. Zero, nada, nothing. So I really ask you to make a
this seems like
directive,
debate, Mr. Chair.
and please rule this out of order.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Can I
Mr. Sarai.
respond to the point of order or not?
Yes, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. Mr. Chair, I think the member characterizes the unfolding of events thus far in this committee very inaccurately. What has allegedly been going on for an hour and a half, this committee didn't even start until closer to 4 o'clock than 3:30, and began with an election of chair. It proceeded with discussion about matters of procedure, and I am now discussing the amendment, and the arguments I am making are fundamental to that amendment, which is around the question of the agenda of the committee and how the agenda of the committee is being set. The reason for my amendment is the fact that I don't think this committee should be prescriptive on the subcommittee on agenda and procedure about the number of meetings that are involved. And as I said, it's not fundamentally
That
about the
should be your
numbers.
amendment,
Do you have the
5
floor,
meetings.
Mr. Sarai, or do I? Okay. These are highly relevant and well within the traditions of this committee to make substantive arguments about these matters, and they are entirely consistent with what has always been permitted in the rules of the committee.
I could ask that you not debate the point of order.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I defer to you.
You may resume, Mr. Johnson.
Resume what? Sorry.
The point of order.
Okay. No, I think my point was made.
Thank you. So the point having been made, now it goes to...
No, but I still have more to say on the substantive matter.
Yes, that's what I said.
Okay.
And I said you may resume.
All
You
right.
gave me that.
Okay, I see. Okay, so we're done the point of order, and now we're resuming on the substantive matter. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I will do my best to continue with where I was before I was again interrupted, and I hope to be able to wrap up my remarks uninterrupted, so that I can complete the point that I was trying to make, and respond to the very reasonable encouragement for Mr. Zubari to really distill the essence of the argument.
I have point of order. I didn't get a ruling on the point of order I had.
Here we go.
Mr. Chair.
I don't have to. Yes. Mr. Mr. Sarai, I understand the point that you have raised, but I'm confident that Mr. Jenis will bear the issue of relevance in mind, and he will keep his remarks focused on the 10 words that are in the amendment to the motion. Mr. Jenis, you can resume.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I can't tell you how much it means to me to have your esteem and confidence as I proceed in this matter. It makes me greatly reassured about the future of this committee, that it is in good hands, and I certainly voted for you to be the chair, lest there be any doubt. Now, Mr. That's not allowed. You can't accuse me of that, Mr. Sarai. But I'll let it go. I'll let it go. Maybe that too will become a practice of the committee. Mr. Chair, on the point, it is my belief that which motivated the fact that we had initially proposed to refer this and other motions to the subcommittee on agenda and procedure to be evaluated. After it was referred to the subcommittee on agenda and procedure, then the subcommittee on agenda and procedure could have come back with specific recommendations. A majority of the committee opposed that proposal to refer the matter to the subcommittee on agenda and procedure. And as a result, we put forward an amendment which said, look, at the very least, let's not be too prescriptive with respect to the committee's foregoing agenda, because there are many emerging issues internationally. Now, if we proceed and say we must spend 5 meetings on this matter, then we're handcuffing ourselves to scheduling a particular number of meetings on that matter. Maybe more, but certainly no less than 5. And likely, given where we are in terms of June, we're looking at that going into the fall and likely displacing other matters that could be on the agenda. We don't know what the fall is going to bring in terms of global events. There's of course the ongoing invasion of Ukraine, and we would certainly hope for an end to that violence before the fall. But I think realistically, the committee will need to prepare itself to be seized with whatever the situation is at that time when it comes to the fall. I think it will be important for us to be ready to continue to study that issue. It's my belief that in light of the particulars of the circumstances that we're seeing globally, that we should be having many meetings specifically on the issue of Ukraine, perhaps scheduling extra meetings on the issue of Ukraine to hear from more witnesses. And what should come out of that is specific recommendations that we can make to the government on the issue of Ukraine. And that's why we moved a motion that was debated for a long time and then retroactively ruled out of order. A motion that said, let's adjourn debate on this issue.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I believe.
Here we go again.
Ms. Ben-Dayan.
I believe now we're engaging in debate over a ruling that not only you made on the previous motion, but that was then contested and voted on, which is entirely irrelevant to the debate.
I say something for 10 seconds, and immediately that's a basis for calling something relevant.
There has been a filibuster of over 16 hours that you have engaged in,
There is
sir.
no filibuster. There are constant efforts to adjourn debate. I'll move a motion now, Mr. Chair. I'll move a motion that the committee proceed to scheduling future meetings with respect to its study on Ukraine. That motion is specifically given as an example on page 1068 of House and Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition. And I share the members' eagerness, eagerness. I hope it's genuine to get back to the work on Ukraine. So I would move that the committee proceed to scheduling future meetings with respect to its study on Ukraine. Thank you. I'm being asked to read the motion one more time. The motion is that the committee proceed to scheduling future meetings with respect to its study on Ukraine.
Having had an opportunity to reflect on Mr. Genis's motion, it appears to me that that is a dilatory motion, and that we can now proceed to a vote on his motion.
Great rule. I agree. 2 for 2. I mean, 2 for
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The motion is to proceed to the other item of business as outlined by Mr. Genuis. Ms. Bendayan. No. Mr. Gahir.
Sorry about that. I vote no.
Mr. Oliphant.
No.
Mr. Sarai.
No.
Mr. Zuberi.
No.
Ms. Gladue.
Yes.
Ms. Gray.
Yes.
Mr. Genuis.
Yes.
Mr. Morantz.
Yes.
Monsieur Bergeron.
No.
Ms. McPherson.
No.
Mr. Chair, that is 7 nays and 4 yeas.
Thank you. So that means that we're going to, so do we go back to the amendment to the motion now? That means we resume debate on the amendment to the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If Liberal members are trying to claim that we're the ones that are holding us back from proceeding to the study on the substantive matters before the committee, that vote just made eminently clear the positions of the parties.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Made it eminently clear.
Ms. Bendayan.
Here we go.
The floor is yours.
Procedurally, is it possible to move to a vote on this amendment at this point, or do we? Is that not possible?
We'll support. We'll support your amendment.
To be clear, we would be willing to support the amendment, so I don't see what the point of this endless debate is. But I understand, Mr. Chair, that might not be a point of order, technically speaking.
Yes. So as I understand it, unless the debate has collapsed with respect to the amendment, we will continue to proceed. That having been said,
sorry. Point of order, Mr. Chair. There might be unanimous consent to suspend the committee for a few minutes for some dialogue.
We actually don't need unanimous consent. We can suspend it if any one of us asks.
Oh,
so
okay.
the committee stands suspended for
Thank you.
5 minutes.
Maybe call the chair.
What's that? Yeah, 5 minutes.
Well, until the call of the chair means you can call it in 5 minutes or more or less as you wish.
No, it will stand suspended for 5 minutes.
As you wish.
Not within 5 minutes, but for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Mr. Jenis, the floor is yours.
Okay, Mr. Chair, given that there's some interest in supporting the amendment, I will cede the floor and hear what others have to say, and we'll go from there. Thanks.
So I guess my question would be, and it is, sort of negotiating in public, but if we could all agree to the amendment, which takes out the minimum number of weeks and allow that to go into scheduling later with the subcommittee, would we have unanimous support to simply move on the motion and get it done and send it into our scheduling routine? That would be the goal.
Yes, Mr. Jenis.
So if we're just chatting informally, I believe we do want to propose just one more amendment with respect to saying, talking about the need to complete the previous work of the committee first. So, I'm happy to say let's let debate collapse on the amendment. Let's vote on the amendment, and then, I'm hopefully getting some feedback in terms of consultations there. But we should be able to then just propose the one more amendment, and if that amendment, if it doesn't have support, okay. If it does have support, okay, and then we'll go from there.
Mr. Chair, we're sort of acting in a slightly committee of the whole fashion right now, which sometimes works, but we have not moved into that. I think it would be helpful if we knew what the amendment was going to be proposed, even though that is a little unusual. But it would just seem to me I don't want to go down a rabbit hole that I don't know where I'm going.
So the clerk reminds me that much like the issue that we faced at the beginning, you cannot have two different amendments before the committee. So we're going to have to we're going to have to vote on this amendment, and then we will proceed to another amendment should that be the case.
It would not be unusual, though, for a member to give an indication of what he or she may be proposing as an amendment in the context of a debate. That could be done. It's not proposing the amendment. It is suggesting what the proposed amendment might possibly be, which would just give us some indication. However, I would like to work in good faith, and we are not wedded to the 5 meetings. It could be 3, could be 2, could be 9. It'll depend on what the agenda committee comes up with, subcommittee on agenda. We're very willing to leave it to that. And we're also very willing to leave the scheduling of this committee, this work, to after we've done important work that we're already doing. We do want to finish the study on vaccines. We do want to study, finish the statement on Ukraine. We do have 2 pieces of legislation that are coming before the committee. We recognize that. We're not dumb. We know that we have work to do. But we would like this motion passed so that we could next fall or whenever we finish with the agenda as it is laid out, deal with it then. So that we have no concern about we're not trying to bump any work. What we're trying to do is to indicate this is work we would like to do in the fall. So I'm looking around our team. We're okay to trust them?
You might not like the amendment. I'm not guaranteeing you'll like the amendment.
Oh, I'm sure we won't.
Okay. But we might as well vote on the thing we agree on, and then we can.
Well, we want it. Frankly, we want a long study. Frankly, Mr. Chair, we would like a study of 5 or 6 weeks, the minimum of 5 weeks. That's what we would like. However, in good faith, we're offering to not do that to try to reach a compromise so we can get out of this filibuster. That's what we're doing. But if we're going to be into a filibuster anyway, we'll keep the 5 weeks. That's just what it is. That's what human beings do.
We'll just say you can accepting the amendment doesn't mean less than 5 meetings, as you've pointed out, right? It means that the matter will be considered by the subcommittee for agenda and procedure at the appropriate time.
Mr. Chair, I would hate to cast aspersions on the mover of that amendment because that seemed to be what they were suggesting. And so you can see why we lose faith, because now we hear that it wasn't even important, but we had an amendment that is now no longer important. We didn't move that amendment.
I think it's very important. So we're having this back and forth if the chair allows. Like the point I made was that it's fundamentally it's not about the numbers. It's about the fact that the parameters of the study should be set by the subcommittee on the agenda and procedure. That is the proper forum of that committee. That's the role of that committee. And my view further is that the focus right now of the committee should be on the invasion of Ukraine, as well as completing our existing work, as well as the legislation we have from the House, which is a total of 5 items, 2 pieces of legislation and 3 studies, which is quite a large amount of work. So those continue to be my points, and I think I've been consistent on them. So I don't want the member to presume that he's going to like everything I'm going to say afterwards. But let's try to proceed. Let's adopt the amendment to go from there.
Mr. Chair, I would just suggest that, with all due respect, I might have read or written a couple of hundred motions at committee. Many of them, in fact, most of them, do stipulate a minimum number of meetings. It is not the work of the subcommittee to put that in. Writers of motions do it every day in all 25 or 26 standing committees of the House of Commons. So that is a normal procedure to put in a number of meetings. It's the work of the agenda and subcommittee to actually deal with that and honor the work of the committee members who have tried to do their best and to come up with a schedule and come back to us. If they can't schedule 5 meetings and they come back to the committee and say we only can fit in 3 because we have other important work, we'll listen to it. So we are willing on the reasonable government side to say we will let that amendment pass, but we are hoping that the official opposition will be reasonable in their suggestions following that, understanding the points that we have been making over the last number of meetings.
So is it the consensus amongst members to proceed to a vote on the amendment? Yes, I'll bring in. Let's move to a vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The vote is on the amendment to delete the words that the committee hold no fewer than 5 meetings. Ms. Bendayan. Mr. Gahir.
I vote yes.
Mr. Oliphant.
Yes.
Mr. Sarai.
Yes.
Mr. Zuberi.
Oui.
Ms. Gladue.
Yes.
Ms. Gray.
Yes.
Mr. Genuis.
Yes.
Mr. Morantz.
Yes.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Oui.
Ms. McPherson.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, that is 11 yeas.
Thank you. So, Mr. Jenis, yes, Mr. Jenis.
Okay, I'm seeking the floor to move my amendment. The amendment is that in the place where the original line that the committee hold no fewer than 5 meetings, that we add in the following line, and that this study not take place until after the completion of the committee's studies on Ukraine, vaccine equity, and Taiwan, as well as studies on legislation sent from the House of Commons, and further, that it not take place until the Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedure submits a report prescribing the manner in which the study is to proceed. Happy to read it again.
Yes, could you?
And that this study not take place until after the completion of the committee's studies on Ukraine, vaccine equity, and Taiwan, as well as studies on legislation sent from the House of Commons, and further, that it not take place until the Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedure submits a report prescribing the manner in which the study is to proceed.
Yes, Ms. Bendayan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure I quite understand the part of the amendment being suggested about the report from the subcommittee. That was not something that I am personally familiar with, so perhaps the member could clarify what he is looking for in that report.
Sure, Mr. Chair, happy to do that. So the subcommittee will at some point meet and it will discuss what happens next. The way I would envision this happening is that we complete what are essentially 5 items before the committee, 3 studies and 2 pieces of legislation. Once that is done, the subcommittee will meet and will say, we have this motion, we have other possible issues. They will discuss, as the subcommittee does, then they will submit a report to us as the main committee. And then that report will be adopted, and it will say, we will do this, and then this, in this order for this many meetings, and then that's how we'll proceed. That's how we got the current agenda we have. It's that the studies we're working on were discussed at the subcommittee. A report came out of the subcommittee. So what we're saying simply is that that this proposed study will happen in a manner prescribed by the subcommittee on agenda and procedure, and it will and that will be after a report has come from the subcommittee to the main committee, prescribing the manner in which it is to proceed, and that will take place following the completion of the committee's work on the issues we're currently studying, as well as legislation. That's our proposal.
Mr. Bergeron.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd say that in the wake of Ms. Bendayan's comments, I was wondering about the last part of the proposed amendment by Mr. Jennis. Insofar as he says that the report would have to do with the way this study should be conducted, I was expecting that the report from the subcommittee indicate a proposal for a timeline, a work plan for the fall. Insofar as there will certainly be other topics for studies that will be proposed, one of the things that concerns me is the issue of the food crisis happening internationally with the conflict in Ukraine and the difficulty of accessing Ukraine's grain reserves for developing countries. The inflation crisis due to an increase in prices of fuel. I think there's a perfect storm there that we should pay attention to. So I'm concerned by the fact that the last part of Mr. Jennis's amendment seems to indicate that it would only have to do with this study on reproductive health of women. Normally, the steering committee would present a work plan for the coming weeks. Unless Mr. Jennis changes his proposed amendment himself, I would have no choice but to have a sub-amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Before going to Ms. Bendayan, that we have been advised that with respect to the allocation of services, we only have access to this room until 5:50. So I just thought I'd advise all members of that. We now proceed to Ms. Bendayan.
Mr. Chair, I guess I look forward to getting to a vote on this, but just perhaps to explain for the benefit of my colleagues, my current thinking is that I'm quite concerned that accepting a report from the subcommittee would mean that we would engage in yet a second filibuster on a vote at that time. And so I am preoccupied and uncomfortable with that piece of the amendment. I'm not sure if the member opposite would like to remove that piece from his amendment, but otherwise we're happy to proceed to a vote.
Ms. McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want some clarity as well. What I'm worried about is that, as Mr. Bergeron or Monsieur Bergeron has brought forward, when things come to this committee that are urgent, we need to have the flexibility to respond to those. Will this dictate what other things that this committee can study? Does that dictate does it take away our ability to have the mobility to study things that may come forward that are urgent in matter?
Mr. Generous.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And you know, we're trying to work and wordsmith a bit on the fly, and I'm never strongly wedded to particular words in particular places. I hope we can work to achieve an understanding. I will say, and I'm particularly aware that, you know, when we're working on the fly, it's a challenge in terms of translation and nuance of language, and so I apologize for not having the French ready. But you know, ideally we get this done before we have to wrap up. But if not, certainly we can have a tightened up translated version distributed, and maybe have some offline discussion on just nailing this down. But since the focus of the discussion has been part 2 of the amendment, I guess first of all, maybe it's worth acknowledging, is there agreement on part 1 of the amendment? Because if there is, that's good. And if there isn't, maybe we can talk about that. But if there is, that's good. The second part is that that it is the normal process for the subcommittee on agenda and procedure to submit a report to the main committee, and that report would then prescribe the work of the committee across a broad range of topics. And at no point in the amendment does it say that particular report would have to be exclusively about the issue of this motion. What I imagine what would happen is that there would be a report from the subcommittee that would come forward that would prescribe work on this as well as a number of other items. So we might have motions on notice on other topics. There are other topics such as issues of access to food that Mr. Bergeron mentioned. The subcommittee on agenda and procedure would take this motion as well as those other motions, compile them, propose a plan, how many meetings, in what order, and build flexibility into that plan, which is what we always do, right? But put forward a plan, and then that report would come to the main committee. And I think it's important to proceed in that fashion. That is, engaging the subcommittee to prescribe an agenda going forward, and it gives every party then the opportunity to say, this is what we want to study, this is what we want to study, and then it all comes together. I think. Look, a subcommittee report, in terms of the possibility of filibusters at that point, a subcommittee report will define the agenda of the whole committee, and it will hopefully reflect a consensus of the subcommittee, which is, in fact, core to the mandate of the subcommittee, which is to work on the basis of consensus. So let's try to move forward with good faith and the understanding that will be the job of the subcommittee, is to take other items, and build an agenda that follows our work on Ukraine, vaccine equity, Taiwan, and the legislation. So I think the amendment achieves the things that both Mr. Bergeron and Ms. McPherson are seeking. But I mean, if either have a sub-amendment to propose that further tightens or clarifies the matter, that's fine. I mean, we can explore it. Thanks.
Mr. Oliphant.
I've lost track of whether or not a sub-amendment is possible, because I don't know where we are. We have an amendment, and this is just the first amendment. We have a motion and an amendment, so we could sub-amend. My concern about the motion is the second part, because I think we could end in an endless loop. But I also have a concern about the first part, in that when we decided to do and started a study on Taiwan, there was not a special committee that the House had set up on Canada-China relations. And it seems to me we need some discussion about whether or not we can get that work over to Canada-China and we can't dictate to another committee what work they do, but we can transfer our testimony that we've already done at one meeting to them with the suggestion that they do that work, so that we could do work like food scarcity here, based on Mr. Bergeron's comment. I think there's some important work. So I just don't like the way this is tying things it feels like our hands are getting tied and we can't be nimble and do stuff. We know we have work to do on two things. We have to finish the COVAX study, or the vaccine equity study, and we have to finish the Ukraine statement. And we know when those are done, we've got 60 days, maybe an extension, to get two pieces of legislation done. That's what we know we have to do. I would like to focus on getting that done and leaving a little flexibility for something like food and energy coming out of the invasion of Russia of Ukraine by Russia. That's so I'm just worried we're tying this down needlessly because we have a motion to do a future study. That's all we've got, and we're not. I guess I'm now thinking against the amendment because it just ties our hands, and I'd sooner like us just to get rid of the motion, pass it, send it off. It'll go into our hamper of work that we want to get done, and as we set our work plans, we'll come back to it. And we may have other things. I mean, we have a notice of motion from Ms. McPherson. I think it's very good on something that just left my mind. Sanctions on the effectiveness of
Review
sanctions.
of the sanctions.
I knew I had it in my head earlier. But there are several things that I think we're going to have to do, and that's all going to come back to us as a committee. I'd just like to get this done, get it out, and move this on so that we can approach our weekend.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Ben là, j'avoue, Monsieur le Président, que je suis un petit peu dubitatif parce que je croyais qu'il y avait essentiellement, dans ma vision des choses, un problème avec la...
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
The interpretation has resumed. Interpretation has resumed. It's fine. Can you hear me? Interpretation has resumed. Mr. Bergeron. Thank you. Is interpretation working now? Great. So what I was saying is that I'm a little doubtful following Mr. Oliphant's statement. I thought there was an issue with the last part only of the proposed amendment. And maybe it's not really a problem given what Mr. Genuis has said. Maybe it's just a nuance in the language that meant that, in my understanding of that last element, that last part, well, that it referred more specifically to women's reproductive health. Mr. Genuis seems to say that the last part of his amendment has to do with all topics that could be studied by the committee over the weeks in the fall. That wasn't how I had understood the last part. So perhaps it's just a question of nuance in the language. But the argument by Mr. Oliphant regarding the first part concerns me a bit. It's not that I think we shouldn't complete what we've begun, but we'll have a decision to make regarding the fact that we'll complete or not what we've begun on Taiwan, or whether or not we recommend that the Special Committee on Canada-China relations continue it. So at this point, I'd say, Mr. Chair, that I'm not too sure what position to take for Mr. Genuis's amendment.
Okay, can I make a point of order to propose a unanimous consent motion? I mean, okay.
Yes, is there a consent?
Okay. All right. So we were told we have till 5:50 with resources. There's some questions around the amendment. We all want to get this issue resolved. Let's refer the amendment to the subcommittee. Let's have a meeting. Let's use the next time slot we have to do a meeting of the subcommittee. And then the subcommittee can come back to the main committee. Because mainly what we're trying to do here in terms of wordsmithing the amendment is generally something that happens at the subcommittee. It's where we talk about, okay, how do we want this? So I would propose that we refer this to the subcommittee meet, and the subcommittee report back to us on this matter.
Mr. Zub.
So it was a request for you to UC,
Yes.
so.
Yeah. I
Now
think
we're
I had
working
my
on this
hand up
motion.
before the
All right,
other
it's denied,
member.
so it's over.
Point of
We do not have unanimous consent. Mr. Zuberi?
Very briefly, thank you for recognizing me, Mr. Chair. I would just suggest that all the parties speak in the interim before the next meeting to please iron this out. Although I do appreciate the procedural learning that's happening for yours truly right here, right now. It's very, very useful and informative. I think we can all agree, or almost all of us, we can all agree that we want to get to the substantive conversation. I'll leave it at that. So I'm pleading that parties speak with each other, iron this out, so we can get to the substantive stuff we actually want to address in this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zuberi. There are several more individuals who'd like to take the floor, but having advised everyone that we only had this room available to 5:50, I'm afraid I'm going to have to suspend this meeting because it is now past 5:50.
Mr. Chair, would you grant an intervention unrelated to this particular topic addressed to the analysts for the benefit of all members? A question to the analysts?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe the analysts were tasked with preparing a statement which we have received on Ukraine. There are, I had indicated many meetings ago that I had comments to that statement. Would the chair and members be amenable to me circulating those comments by email to everyone so that we can move our work forward on that statement? And other members are free to respond by email with their own comments.
I'm sorry?
I'm simply trying to move our work forward, Mr. Chair.
Until having spoken to the analysts and the clerk, they are advising that if anyone does have any comments or would like to make any changes to the statement, they should do so by end of business on Monday.
Mr. Chair, could we do that with the vaccine equity draft as well?
I mean, just on the vaccine equity issue, sorry, like the question is when are we going to study that report? Because I don't know that we want to set the same deadline for amendments on both the statement and the study. So I guess it comes down to which ones we're planning on studying first, and then setting deadlines that are proportionate, that are appropriate in relation to those dates.
On that specific issue, Ms. McPherson, I'll have to consult with the vice chairs, and we'll get back to you. But it now being 5:55, the meeting stands suspended. Thank you.